possible, make it as powdery as possible, so that when we have the hydrochloric acid, we'll get good contact to dissolve out the extra sodium hydroxide. And it's quite powdery now, it's not really wet at all. So that's been going for just about 10 minutes, it's maybe 8 minutes after. And I think it's probably done. So I'm going to set that aside and measure out my 2 milliliters of hydrochloric acid, 10% hydrochloric acid, it's about 2 pipettes full, roughly. And I'm going to make my 95% ethanol by adding 19 milliliters of ethanol and 1 milliliter of DI water to a 50 milliliter graduated cylinder. And we'll just pour that into this beaker to get it well mixed. And that'll be our recrystallization solvent. So now I'm going to add the hydrochloric acid. It's 10 after 12, 11 or 12 after 5. So it's been about 10 minutes, a little bit more. Just going to run that down the stirring rod. And give it a good mix. And then add the other milliliter. The goal here is to grind that solid up, make sure that the sodium hydroxide comes into contact with the HCl and we get it neutralized. And then we're going to use this pH paper to confirm that we've succeeded in acidifying the solution before we do the filtration. Trying to scrape any solid off the walls that I didn't already succeed in scraping, and get that last little bit of solid off the stirring rod, which I'll probably need a little help from my micro spatula as well. Definitely a nice suspension. Doesn't look like there are any huge chunks left. Reach in with this again and try to scrape the last bits off the stirring rod. There's one significant chunk there that's really wanting to stay stuck. So we'll get that off of there. That's pretty good. Got this solid off of there. See if we have an acidic solution. Yeah, it's nice and red. Definitely acidic. We've succeeded in acidifying the material. So we're going to need to wash with 2 milliliters of DI water. So we'll just use this last pipette to, this was the HCl. Use this last pipette to measure out 2 milliliters of water. Apply vacuum. Cover the holes with that piece of paper. And we want to make sure that's wet. I'm just going to actually use a little bit of water from the ice bath to seal that paper down tight. To filter this. And I'm going to turn this on and start heating my ethanol. But I want it to not bump. I'm just going to stick a couple of boiling stones in there this time instead of a stirrer. That should prevent it from boiling too vigorously. And this pipette. Be for my ethanol. And pour that in there all at once. Try to get as much solid out as we can initially, and then we'll use our 2 milliliters of water to wash the rest out. Looks like a yellow powder. Pale yellow. So 1 milliliter wash. Help the solid off the walls. Still some solid that wants to stay. And we're going to do a second wash. That's most of it. And then we're just going to rinse that. A little bit of ice water from the water bath. Just to get any HCl that's in there out of there. So we're going to do the recrystallization in a 25 milliliter Erlenmeyer flask. And I'm going to mask that. And then I can get a crude yield. So 23.650 gram on our Erlenmeyer flask. 23.650 gram. And we really don't need to let this dry for very long. Now, take that out of there. going to be using that again, so I'll just leave it sit. Transfer that to our other assembly. And then we can use our micro spatula to try to pull that solid into the flats for recrystallization. See, it's a relatively powdery material. Unfortunately, that piece of filter paper just came loose. I'm just going to let it go in there since it wants to. I'll pull it out later. Good enough. Scrape the solid off that paper. And I have these tweezers out for this purpose. I need them. Most of the solid off. There's a little bit, but not much. And we've got a mass of this so we can get a crude yield. .136 grams. 24.136. Now we're going to add a boiling stone to that. We're going to heat this up to about 150, because 150 on the dial is enough to boil ethanol, which boils at 78. I'm going to put just 2 little boiling stones in there so that doesn't bump. And we can set our new filtration assembly for our purified material. That's mostly water. Need to get out one more piece of filter paper. Establish vacuum again. And we'll just wet that down. A little bit of ice water. That'll be for cooling the ethanol and for cooling the mixture once we get it in there. I'm going to go ahead and add 1 pipette full for now of the solvent. And then I'm going to start heating that as well. So we heat those side by side. This was just used for making up 95% ethanol, so it can dry in the cabinet. I am through with these solvents. And we'll put those away while we're waiting for it to heat. Grab some methylene chloride. And I'm going to grab a GCMS spec vial. I'm going to be making up a sample for GCMS spec in dichloromethane. That crude material is DCl-10-66A. So the recrystallization will be 66B. So we'll have that at the ready. You'll notice it's bumping a little bit. I'm going to take that off while I put this pencil away so it doesn't bump and spill.